We're going to get started for another Fire Drill Friday. I know that this is quite a time. Our country is going through really unparalleled anguish and soul searching right now. And I know that we're scared of the violence unleashed by Trump and his lackeys and the implications that this might have going forward. But, you know, horrific as this last week has been, we need to keep in mind that it means that we're winning. Okay, more folks are standing in solidarity with the movement for Black lives than ever before, and with our essential frontline workers, many of whom are people of color. More people than ever understand the urgency of the climate crisis and are willing to join the movement to address it. The haters, you know, the white supremacists and hoax believers have resorted to violence because they're desperate. They represent a wounded beast thrashing about, and wounded beasts are dangerous, no question. But they're in the minority. I mean, there are a lot of people, that's true, but they're in a minority and they're violent, which means they're never going to win over the majority. We have to keep that in mind. And I really firmly believe that the antidote to all this is what we're doing here with Fire Drill Fridays and Greenpeace, strengthening our understanding of the climate crisis and growing our numbers in order to have the greatest impact on what happens next. And in that regard, I ask two things of you. Keep talking about the climate crisis to people you encounter. Give people copies of my book if you can. It's an easy read, so that's one thing that you can do. And the other is to try to help us grow our numbers. Since last March, we've had, dig this, 8,068,000 viewers across all platforms, and thousands of you signed up as volunteers. And all of those volunteers really made a difference, both in the general election and in the Georgia runoffs. If you're watching on social media and believe in what we're doing, click the share button now and share today's show with your network, okay? Help me grow our numbers so that we can really make ourselves felt when we're going to be called upon. Do you know that during this pandemic, when we were hardly flying or driving at all, carbon emissions only fell by an estimated 8%? Only 8%. But here's the thing. We need carbon emissions to fall 6 to 8% every year, even when there's no pandemic, up until 2030, so as to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. You see why individual action is not going to get us there? It's not going to be easy. The problem is that the US and other developed countries are planning to increase their fossil fuel output by 2% a year. This is what we have to stop, and it's going to take millions of us. You get me? Okay, so let's have a little bit of good news. I always use some good news, and there is good news. A coalition of more than 50 countries has committed to protect almost 1/3 of the planet by 2030 to halt the destruction of the natural world and slow extinctions of wildlife. The coalition is called the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, which includes the UK and countries from 6 continents. They've made the pledge to protect at least 30% of the planet's land and oceans at the One Planet Summit in Paris this last Monday. It was hosted by the French President Emmanuel Macron. So that's good. The second piece of good news is that Massachusetts plans on ending the sale of new gas-powered vehicles by 2035, following California's lead in an effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Go Massachusetts. All right, well, the theme for today is ending new fossil fuel leasing on our public lands and waters. This is what we have to get Biden to do. I assume that most folks that are watching this don't live in a fossil fuel hotspot, you know, places where drilling and fracking and refineries exist. About an hour south of Los Angeles, there is one such hotspot. It's the city of Wilmington in the port of Los Angeles. We held an in-person fire drill Friday there in early March, before the pandemic. You could smell the benzene, and our eyes burned after just an hour. And we spoke to people whose health has been compromised. The federal Gulf of Mexico is another major hotspot. Together with Wyoming, the Gulf has produced 73% of the federal and Indian lands' fossil fuels, probably the largest concentration of fossil fuel infrastructure anywhere. Over 45% of total US petroleum refining capacity is located there, as well as 51% of total US natural gas processing plant capacity. The facilities are located mostly in low income and communities of color. And what this means for those people is high rates of asthma and chronic lung conditions, heart problems, cancer, premature births, and low birth weight babies. And that's the biggest cause of disabilities and death. When we talk about environmental justice, what we mean is that these people and their communities must be among the first to receive help in cleaning up. And the companies themselves must be made to pay for the cleanup, right? A lot of work needs to be done to help the Gulf communities become much more resilient in the face of the worsening hurricanes that have done so much damage there, due in part to the warming ocean. 5 Category 5 hurricanes have hit the Gulf just last year, 5 of them. And because of the proliferation of petrochemical plants and refineries along the coast, damage from leaks during hurricanes can be very dangerous, very toxic. Plus, the land along the coast is sinking. It's sinking, and it makes it extremely vulnerable to rising sea levels. Oil drilling has devastated parts of the Alaska's environment. As part of a parting gesture, Trump has just opened up the fragile Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to drilling. We have to make sure that that stops. President-elect Biden has the authority to stop new oil and gas leases on our public lands and waters and phase out existing fossil fuel production as quickly as possible while protecting workers and communities. Our first speaker today knows firsthand the impacts of the threat of drilling and what it has done to her community. Her name is Quannah Chasinghorse. She's an 18-year-old activist from the Gwich'in and Oglala Lakota tribes and lives in Fairbanks, Alaska. Together with her mother, she's an Indigenous land protector for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, protecting those sacred lands from oil development and fighting for climate justice. Quannah's deep connection to the lands and to her people's way of life guides and informs everything she does and stands for. She's passionate about Indigenous rights, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and Indigenous representation. Quannah was honored to make the 2020 list of Teen Vogue's top 21 under 21. And our second guest, Jayeesha Dutta in New Orleans, is a just and sustainable startup entrepreneur currently working on opening Marbari, the social justice spa, and a co-founding member of another Gulf is Possible collaborative, which aims for a just and equitable transition away from the extractive industries in the Gulf South, particularly around stopping offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. Jayeesha serves on the boards of the Climate Justice Alliance, Alternate Roots, South Asian Americans Leading Together, and Eyewitness Palestine. Welcome to you both. I'm so grateful that you've found time to join us on Fire Drill Fridays. Let me start with you, Quannah. When did you start being an activist?
Well, it all started at a very young age. I grew up in the movement, and my mom and my aunties really did a good job with educating me throughout my life, with the ongoing Indigenous issues that we face. And it's not just Indigenous people, it's all BIPOC people. And, raised
Explain
in,
what that is.
yes, Black, Indigenous, people of color. So that's what BIPOC is. And just, growing up in this movement really made me passionate, and also growing up with my Indigenous values and knowing, my connection and my spirituality to the lands, growing up on the lands. And so with that, you know, my first time really working, and it wasn't even work, it was more of just using my voice. It was me realizing that, that Indigenous people don't get enough representation, don't get enough recognition for anything. And so at a young age, I really started looking into a lot of these things. And it all started pretty much in seventh grade when I made the change from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day within our school district. And that was pretty big.
Fantastic. And now you focus on the Arctic Refuge. Why is the Arctic Refuge so important?
It is so important for so many things. It is so interconnected with the world. The Arctic Refuge is ground zero for the climate crisis. It is the place that is the most impacted, and it is thawing twice the rate anywhere else. The Arctic Refuge is sacred lands to my people, but not just Gwich'in people, to Inupiat people, to Inupiaq people. And so, people, we need more people standing in solidarity with us, because not only are these lands sacred to us, but it is sacred land to everybody, I feel like, because it is so interconnected with the world. If you look at different maps and data, it shows how interconnected the Arctic is with the world, and it affects the entire world. And so every change that we see within the Arctic, it affects the rest of us. So the Arctic is so pristine and so wild. It is one of the largest and the last Arctic or wildlife refuge that is, it was protected, but the Trump administration keeps trying to attack those lands by he had opened them up to drilling and started the sale leases. And so with that, the Arctic, I feel like, is not, like I said before, is not just sacred to me and my people, but it is a sacred place for all living people and animals, especially the animals. It is habitat to thousands and hundreds of different species of animals. And so with that, we don't need
Caribou, right?
yeah, yeah, it is the birthing grounds of the porcupine caribou herd, and the porcupine caribou herd are the last migrational mammal that travels as far as they travel. Their migration route is so long; it goes in and out of Canada and Alaska, and so we need that needs to be protected.
So what is your activism on behalf of the Arctic Refuge? What does it consist of? What are you doing?
I do a lot of social media work. If you look at my social medias, you can see a lot of the call to actions I do through social media, but also I do work with a lot of nonprofit organizations, partnerships, and people wanting to learn more about it. It really just educating people on what's going on in Alaska. Not too many people understand or even know what's going on in Alaska. And so really getting the message out there is a big thing, but also recognizing that this isn't just a problem that came out of nowhere. It's been a problem for 30 to 40 years. I'm the fourth generation fighting this. And it has been a problem for so long, in that it has been in the dark for so long. And so finally, we're getting the recognition and the attention that it has needed for so long. And now we're really getting somewhere with it. But we just need more action within the people in power.
Jayeesha, where do you live on the Gulf of Mexico? I feel like the Gulf is where some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis are felt and where some of the worst causes of the crisis are located. Where do you live, and do you agree with that?
Yeah, thank you, Jane. Thanks for having me on Fire Drill Friday today, because definitely I live in New Orleans. I agree with you in that we live in a place that has the compounded intersection of, rising sea level, sinking land, intense fossil fuel infrastructure, as well as things like we don't even consider or talk about a lot. Generally in like the mainstream media about the toxic dead zone from industrial agricultural pollution that comes down the Mississippi River. So we have kind of layer upon layer upon layer of issues. And then you have, moments like the BP oil disaster in 2010, which, as we all know, was the largest oil disaster in world history. And so, yeah, I definitely agree. Where the place I live, before I moved to New Orleans, I didn't consider myself so much an environmental activist or climate justice champion, but living where I live, I don't think there's any way to really be conscious of what's going on and not want to be taking some action. And that's a lot of the work that we're doing, is trying to get our people in our region to realize that if we don't do something now, it's not just to our peril in the region, it's the whole planet is suffering, But we feel like we're at a pivot point, I think very similar to what Quannah is saying, like the place that we live is so sacred, is so special. The Gulf of Mexico is a very precious place, the wetlands and the waters. There's so many creatures that are unique to our region, to our place. And we just kind of treat it as a sacrifice zone for the energy needs of the country.
Well, what's it like for someone like you, of an environmental warrior, to be living in one of the most conservative states in the country? I mean, they're believing the hoax about the election. Elected officials there have sided with the insurrectionists from last week, and obviously they don't like work that is trying to shut down fossil fuels. What's it like for you? How do you make any progress?
I mean, I think we're up against a lot. We are up against really the corporate control of our political system, particularly in, well, all the states really, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida. Specifically, Texas and Louisiana is where we see super huge amounts of fossil fuel infrastructure for oil and gas in particular. We see these companies, having lots of lobbying money and political campaigns. And even though, Louisiana right now, we do have a Democratic governor. However, that governor is still in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry. And so we really think that, we say as a collaborative, the collective I'm part of, Another Gulf is Possible, that part of the reason the corporations have such a strong control in the fossil fuel industry is because they have convinced people's minds that this is the only way that this region can thrive. Like, this is the only way you can get a paycheck. And so part of what we want to do is start to think of other ways, like how can we get back into balance with our planet? How can we be back in balance with the land, and not extracting from it, but figuring out regenerative ways to be with the earth, with the water, with each other, and that there are other possibilities. There are other ways to be. And so in a small way, we're trying to model that and share that through our storytelling and art and media and culture work, to have people really imagine that this is there is a way for our region to be that isn't dependent on fossil fuels. And so I think once people really understand that, they'll start to demand that from our political system. And so we feel like we're really at a place of getting that cultural shift, that mental shift in place, so that the political will can follow. I don't believe if people really understood the peril we were in, they would allow the corporations to continue to have control. I think there's a false narrative that has really been accepted by people. And so we're trying to challenge that in the work that we do.
How concerned are the people who live in the Gulf about the climate crisis? Do they believe in a climate crisis?
I think with 5, like you were saying at the beginning, 5 category 5 hurricanes in one season, even the most conservative person can't deny that something is different, that things are getting worse. I think there's different reasons to attribute to that. I think the science of it is maybe a little bit controversial still amongst the folks who have political differences. But I think the impact and people seeing these storms are coming stronger and stronger, more and more, you can't really deny that. And I think what we need to do again is get folks to really start to understand what's going on beyond the political rhetoric and really look at the impacts it's having on our communities. You know, really share like things like the BP oil disaster. So many stories still haven't even been shared around the toxic impacts of the Corexit, the toxic dispersants that were put into the waters. We're seeing years later now, 10 years later, that people are dying, people are getting sick. And so I think once those stories are really shared and understood, I believe that the change will and can and must happen. And we really did do a lot of work during the Obama administration pushing for an end to the oil and gas lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico. We had actually the founding When Other Gulf is Possible was based in that campaign in 2016, which we shut down. We did shut down for temporarily an oil and gas lease sale that was happening in the Superdome. And then, we know what happened with the election in 2016, and that campaign really took a backseat to pressing issues with who was in the White House. And I think right now with Biden, I think this petition that is our call to action today, right? Like there is an opportunity to say in this administration, we are going to commit to ending fossil fuels and figuring out a way that we can move forward that is in the health and wellness of with no sacrifice zones. Not Quannah's community, not my community. No community should be sacrificed, right?
Quannah, what's happening in your communities? What's changed because of the oil industry's influence?
A lot has changed. As you know, Alaska is a red state, so the Indigenous voice and perspective is kind of pushed out, and it's sad. But the louder and stronger we get, the more people are upset about that, because we're starting to really uncover the harms of what the oil and gas industry has been doing, the fossil fuel industry has been doing to our people that still live in rural Alaska, that still lives our ways of life. And still, my people still depend on our ways of life. We still hunt, we still fish, and that's something we greatly depend on because it takes a lot of money. It's very expensive to travel in and out of these villages to get to the city. Some places you can only get by boat through the Yukon River, and it can be dangerous, or some you can only fly to in bush plane. And so
you rely on your hunting and fishing to feed yourselves.
Yes, very much. We heavily rely on our fishing seasons. We heavily rely on our hunting seasons.
So how has the oil affected that?
It's affected it so much because of the climate crisis. There's a lot of communities, a lot of Indigenous communities that are kind of surrounded by the oil fields, and they're feeling it heavily, the pollution and how it's affecting them with asthma and cancers, and how it's affecting the animals. Not only are people getting sick, but the animals are getting sick, and the animals is what keeps us healthy. If they're sick, we're not healthy. And so seeing that impact and seeing how, something that we've been depending on for thousands and thousands of years, and seeing that making us sick now, when it's something that usually we go to for healing, it's sad. It is very sad. That's something that we should be able to, continue to do, is live our ways of life without having to deal with these kind of threats. And not only that, but the climate crisis is huge, as in the Gulf of Mexico. You see how we're in two completely different places, but we're seeing the effects so drastically.
What about the fires that have been happening?
Oh my gosh, in the summer times, we have been having record-breaking fires in Alaska, and that hasn't been in the mainstream media at all. Where I live in Fairbanks, Alaska, it's kind of a small city, but it's kind of in the middle of Alaska, in the interior of Alaska. And in the summertime, We've had the smoke come into where I live in Fairbanks so heavily into the city, and it's so hard to just go outside because you want to spend time outside in beautiful Alaska, right? Because Alaska is beautiful and pristine land, but you can't because you can't enjoy that without feeling sick or getting asthma or something. And this summer, we went out to our fish camp, which is out in the Yukon River, and it almost got burnt down by a huge wildfire. And we had a whole fire squad at our camp, based out on our camp, and they put sprinklers all around our camp. They kept it protected from these fires, and it got so close. I remember we were at the fish camp too, when it was happening, and it was very scary. So, there's huge, huge changes within our lands, within our animals, within my people. And it's not good changes. It's something that we shouldn't have to deal with, and we do.
Jayeesha, do you see these kind of impacts in the Gulf region? How is it affecting your everyday life?
The impacts of climate change?
Climate change and the fossil fuels.
Yeah, I mean, I think we, on a everyday basis, right? Everybody who lives on a fence line community next to those refineries and chemical plants and all of the industrial infrastructure in our region have to breathe in toxic chemicals day after day. I think some of us who live a little bit further, a little bit downwind, it's only on certain days that you go outside and you have that smell, and you know that isn't something that's good for my body, right? I live in a place that between New Orleans and Baton Rouge is known as Cancer Alley, where we have really, really high rates of cancer. To this day, there still isn't any kind of recognition or reckoning to support those people who have to deal with those health impacts. And again, the health impacts of things like the BP oil disaster are still not known. We still don't know long-term impacts of eating the seafood that we've been eating for the last 10 years. A lot, if you talk to some activists, there are people who stopped eating seafood. I personally don't, because I was born in Mobile, Alabama. My first favorite food was shrimp, and I'm not going to stop eating the shrimp, but I don't know what that's going to do to my body in the long term. Right?
How has it affected the fishing industry and the shrimp industry?
Yeah, I mean, during the oil disaster, there was obviously devastating consequences because people couldn't go out into the water to shrimp or fish or oyster, get their oysters. There was, I think, 5 billion oysters died, something like that, during the oil disaster itself. And a lot of those fisher folks were the people who went out in the water to try to clean it up and then got sick. So that's kind of the fisher people themselves. The fishing industry has had really uneven catch harvests for the last 10 years, where people there's a good year, there's a bad year, and it's really hard for fisher folk to tell what's going to come in. So it's really hard to make a living, right? And so you're seeing a lot of people who have for generations made their living from the water, not knowing whether they can count on that anymore. And so again, that's another reason for us to really think about our reliance on fossil fuel, which is a newer process in terms of the long game of human history in the Gulf Coast of Mexico, that we're kind of potentially sacrificing that entire way of being, which is to be in relationship with the water, to harvest from the water, but also to steward and take care of the water. We're not doing a good job of that. So I think if you talk to the fisher folk, they would, most of them will agree, no matter what side of the political spectrum they're on, we're doing something wrong right now.
Yvette Arellano, who is a young environmental activist in Houston, she spoke at Fire Drill Friday in DC, and she blew my mind because she described in very specific detail what it was like to grow up as she has in Houston, in the shadow of petrochemical companies and refineries, and how they were always having to shelter in place. I'd never heard that word before. Of course, now it's become commonplace with the pandemic, but there were always leaks or explosions. Then they would have to, cover their windows and doors with plastic. They couldn't go outside for days, weeks at a time. people who were sick couldn't get medicine. And she grew up thinking it was normal, you know, for everybody to have asthma and to smell benzene and, you know, to have your eyes watering and to have to be sheltered at home. Just terrible. So are people's feelings about the oil industry changing at all with all these, are they concerned because of all these extreme weather events that are happening?
I think more and more, I would say yes. I think the connection still, we need to do a better job in terms of our narrative building work for folks to really understand the connection between the climate crisis, climate catastrophe, these storms that keep coming, the land that's sinking, and all of this, these oil wells and gas, you know, rigs that are polluting our waters and our lands. I think there's, again, a growing number of people. I think there's also a proliferation of false solutions to the problem. So even when you find somebody who's agreed to the problem, the way to fix it is where we're kind of getting stuck a little bit now politically in our region.
What are the, what are you?
So some of the false solutions, for example, in Louisiana, we have the so-called master plan to deal with climate change. And this master plan includes the predominant solution within it is to build a levee wall from the Gulf to Morganza, which is like across kind of the most vulnerable area in Southeast Louisiana. Statistics say within 20 years, by the time they finish the wall, the sea will probably rise to be over that wall. So it's like you're putting all this money into the engineering, and really, let's talk about, it's really for those engineering contracts that the political will exists to put into this project, but that solution itself isn't necessarily going to be the thing that helps protect people in the long run. What would protect, sorry, go ahead.
Why is the land sinking?
Because we live in a swamp where we are building canals and lots of different infrastructure for the oil and gas industry that's taking away the wetlands, which, you know, if you think about the ecosystem of our region, we don't have rocks, we have mud, and then it's really all of the wetlands that kind of continues to have that land that we can live on. And so you take that away, and then you have the rising sea. The land's always sinking where we live, but much slower than it is once you take away all of the wetlands that we have been doing to build the oil and gas infrastructure. Wow. So again, it's like layer upon layer of all these issues that, you know, we're hoping we get more and more folks to understand the crisis that we're in, and sign on to things like stopping leasing in the, like, let's just stop the leasing first. Then we can talk about all the other things we need to do.
Right. Yep. Well, Quannah, in the press conference yesterday that Biden had, one of the things that he has included in his $1.9 trillion package that he's hoping to get passed was a lot of help to improve the health infrastructure on indigenous lands. What else do you think the Biden administration should be doing in the next few years?
I feel like, you know, his big thing yesterday was, you know, him helping Indigenous people with their healthcare and whatnot. But, you know, if he genuinely cares about Indigenous people, our health and our well-being, then he should stop the oil and gas industry, the fossil fuel industry, because that's a big part of our health. A big part of our health is our identity as well. And that's being taken away along with, you know, our lands. You know, you see how our people and how people all over are affected by the pollution of the fossil fuel industry. You see how people are getting sick from it, and how, you know, how much it's also impacting the animals around it. And he wants to talk about healthcare. We must hold Biden to his word and let him know that we aren't kidding when we're talking about these things, because this is about health. This is about our well-being, and this is about the lands and the future. And so if he really genuinely cares about all of that, then we need to make sure, and we ask him politely stop fossil fuel extraction and start moving to a cleaner way of not even extracting, but energy. We need clean energy, because if we keep extracting and extracting, then we're going to have nothing left. And, you know, we'll have all of this money, but what for if we have no land left?
Right. So many people go to Alaska to work in the oil fields, good jobs, union jobs, etc. What do you say to those people? You're talking about doing away with fossil fuels or phasing out. So what do you say to the workers?
What I say is, I completely understand. I have friends and family, and some people that I know very close to my heart, that, you know, they greatly depend on their jobs. And Alaska's economy is based off of the oil and gas industry and the extraction. And it kind of sucks that that's how we are and that's where we're at. But it's a lot bigger than that. You know, I feel like this whole thing with the fossil fuel industry, it's a lot bigger than that. And, you know, when we talk about asking Biden to stop fracking and the oil and gas industry, to stop fossil fuel extraction, then we ask him not to stop those jobs. We ask him to create new jobs so that these people don't, you know, go home jobless and can't provide for their families. It doesn't work like that. We need Biden to really step up and do what we ask, just not even do what we ask, but consider it, because this is people's lives, not just the indigenous peoples that are affected by it, but the people that are also working for these fossil fuel industries. And we need people to understand that this is, like, we're not trying to take away your jobs. We're not trying to stop you from working or making your money. We just want to stop the climate change, you know, the warming temperatures. We want to, you know, continue to live our ways of life without having to deal with these kind of threats. And so that's all we're asking. So that's where I kind of stand with that.
Tell me, you work on missing Indigenous women and girls. Tell me, what is the relationship between that and the oil industry?
So not many people know, but it is very interconnected. The climate crisis, oil and gas industry, and missing and murdered Indigenous women. And some people get confused and don't really understand, but I think it's because people don't even realize that a lot of the places that are trying to that are under attack by the fossil fuel industry is sacred lands to Indigenous people. Not just the Arctic Refuge, it's all over in the Amazon, in Alaska, obviously, in Bears Ears. They're The big thing is the man camps, which are placed right outside Indigenous communities. And that's why a lot of people are really being affected by, you know, the fossil fuel industry, but not just because of the pollution, but because of the man camps. And it puts more Native women at risk for becoming murdered or missing. And so the rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women surrounding these man camps are sky high. And it's so sad because I personally have been affected by missing and murdered Indigenous women. And it's something that is also very personal to me. So when we talk about the oil and gas industry, we don't just talk about the climate crisis. We talk about the murdered and missing Indigenous women that are still missing, or their cases have gone cold and they deserve justice, and we don't need any more of that kind of thing going on.
Let's take some audience questions. Maddie, do you have any audience questions? I'm sure you do.
We sure do. So from Brianna on Zoom, as you've said, we know that the fossil fuel industry is linked to social and economic injustices affecting Black and Brown communities. What can I do to defend my community against oil corporations?
Which one of you would like to answer that?
I mean, I think the easy answer at this moment is really to help pressure the Biden administration to end future fossil fuel leasing. And then I think the long-term goal is to just stop it altogether. But I do think there is a lot of political feasibility in stopping the new leases from going forward. And so I think that's something that, if not in your community, it's in my community, and all of our communities are connected. And so if we can stop that from happening, we are doing a good job at starting to stop it from happening to everybody. So I think it's really thinking about breaking down that not in my backyard mentality to really consider the fact that all our waters, all our lands, I think the coronavirus has really shown, this tiny little virus that started in Wuhan, China, has, connected all of us. All of our bodies are connected. And so to really think in that way, so that if we can get this one, seeing it as a domino effect, maybe if we can start this process to get the leases stopped, we can stop the fossil fuel industry as a whole.
Thank you. Next question, Maddie.
So right on that subject, we have from Anna on Zoom. What do we do, or what are the implications if Biden does or does not pass an executive order on ending fossil fuel leasing?
Quannah, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, if he does, then it will be a huge victory for not just Indigenous peoples, but the whole world entirely, because you see the effects of the fossil fuel extraction and how it is in its communities that it's affecting right there at the front lines, but also just everywhere. The climate crisis and the climate change is changing so fast and rapidly that our animals and the lands can't keep up. And so that's what's harming. And if he doesn't, it'll just get worse. I feel like, my people and people all over will be suffering so much. And it just sucks to see, that we came this far. It took hundreds, not even hundreds, but a couple years to even get the attention that we needed from mainstream media. But we're at this point where, it's either the Trump administration succeeds in the oil and gas industry up here in Alaska, or he completely fails and we rely on Biden to make that choice. And I'm really hoping he obviously makes the right choice and to stop all fossil fuel extractions. But at this point, we just need to make it known that there is, at this point, I feel like there is no choice. Like, he has to make sure that there is no more extraction.
Right on. Well, that's why Fire Drill Fridays is trying to build up our numbers along with a lot of other climate organizations, is because it's going to take unprecedented numbers of people to not beg him, to force him, to make it impossible for him not to live up to what he has promised, which is no new fossil fuel extraction on public lands and waters, and then begin a gradual phase out to zero by mid-century. We have to be prepared to force him to do it. There's too much at stake. This is a civilizational crisis, right, Jayeesha?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost beyond a crisis, right? It's I don't even know what this is, existential peril that we are in. And so I think certain places are facing it much closer at hand. I think Quannah's community and my community, it's like right here. So you can't, we have to face it. I think people who have the privilege and luxury to maybe not be thinking about it as much, it's like, this is the time. We all have to come together to think about it. And I think I want to underline the point of the public lands and waters, right? It is public lands and waters that is being leased at pennies to these corporations to extract from. They don't pay. I mean, first, I don't believe in the capitalist system of paying for land and water, but they're not, we're basically giving it away to them. And we did try at one point that campaign a few years, 4 or 5 years ago, to put in a bid to see, as we are the public, can we put in a bid for, taking, stewardship of some. They won't give it to us, right? They won't lease any of them, those lands to us, the waters to us. but they will to the corporation. So I think the egregiousness of it, I think if people understood, we could get Biden to do this. So I really appreciate your like trying to get the numbers, because I think if the public really understood how we're just giving it away, giving our land and water to these corporations to extract from, given the climate crisis, it's unconscionable, really.
Maddie?
Yes, so from Barbara on Zoom, what is the most helpful action for Canadians to take? As your neighbor, what kind of help would be the most useful?
Jayeesha?
Oh, I was going to say Quannah, since you're closer to Canada, I feel like. Yeah.
Do you mind repeating the question? It kind of glitched out and I couldn't hear what she said much.
Absolutely. Barbara on Zoom was just asking what the most helpful thing she could do as a Canadian would be.
Oh, okay, awesome. I feel like it would just be, you know, like we said, getting the numbers out there of, you know, making sure people understand what's going on and the risks of, you know, everything. And just, you know, putting pressure on, you know, these people. Like in Alaska, we have been sending letters and emails to our representatives and stuff, just telling them, letting them know where we stand with this, because, you know, they have been pushing out that side of Alaska, pushing out the people that are against oil, because like I said, oil is a big part of Alaska's economy. And so they've been trying their hardest to push and silence us. And so the louder we get and the more people that can get their attention to really recognize what's going on and why we don't need that, why we don't want it, then it will make a huge change. So really just getting the word out there, making sure people understand what's going on, and just continuing to put pressure on the people that can make these changes.
Yeah, and I would also add that Canada, the tar sands of Canada, you know, that's there's some work to do in just thinking about, again, we're all connected.
Yeah.
There's some work to do in pressuring Canadian government to stop the extraction on specifically Indigenous lands there. So.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for that.
Thank you. And this question is for both of you, Quannah and Jayeesha. From Shalona on Zoom, what are some of the projects you'll be working on in the next year?
I will be working on a lot of course, just making sure that Biden really sticks to his word. So making sure that he stops fracking, just trying to get more pressure on him. And so just hoping he understands that the risks and how much we don't want that here in Alaska, but also all over in the US. And I feel like this is just something that I feel like I need to say. And I feel like with climate science, it also needs to be tied to Indigenous knowledge. There's a lot of Indigenous knowledge that isn't included. And Indigenous people are the least to contribute to climate change, but are the most impacted. And especially the people that are at the front lines, not just Indigenous people, but the people that are at the front lines. And so, you know, also working the political environment in Alaska. And so, yeah, that's where I feel like I'll be working on a lot.
Yeah, thanks for that question. As a collective, you know, Another Gulf is Possible collaborative is working on revitalizing a participatory journalism and multimedia platform called Bridge the Gulf, which the intention of that, like I was saying, a lot of these stories don't get out, is to bring the stories from the ground to the public. A lot of the stories that the mainstream media doesn't cover. So we want to empower people to tell their own stories. And that's actually a platform that's been, I think, started right around Hurricane Katrina. So funding has come and gone. And so we want to see that platform revitalized. So please be on the lookout for Bridge the Gulf coming back in full force soon. And also, like I was saying, we want to be modeling small prototypes of what could be. And so we have a project called Cisterns, where about half of our members are experimenting with what does it look like to have water sovereignty. We have a float lab project where we're trying to model different ways of clean energy. Some people have never seen a solar panel or really understand how these things work. So part of it is like, how can we show, like, have solar powered drive-in movies, right? So people, we can say this whole movie was shown to you by a solar energy, right? So things like that, where we can show people the technologies and the infrastructures and the processes that can get us out of the pickle that we're in, are some of the kind of ways in which we're working, as well as centering healing justice and transformative justice. Because again, the balance we have to get back into isn't just with the planet. There's also a balance we have to get back into with each other. And I think what we saw happen in DC recently shows how far we've gotten and how divided and how much hate and fear has come to dominate our discourse and our ways of being with each other. So we also, as a collective, really want to practice healing justice for ourselves as individuals, to be healthy and well in this time where that's such a big question for everybody, and so many people dying from a virus that could be easily contained, as well as, you know, interpersonal relationships, and really focusing on that. And I think a lot of times we separate those things, but in our work, we want to bring those things together. So.
Thank you. I have another question for both of you from Lily on Twitter. What is your favorite anti-fossil fuel success story, and what can we learn from that?
Great question.
Well, I feel like for me, a big success is recently, you know, the Trump administration had opened the Arctic Refuge to oil and gas. And we were all really putting pressure on the big oil corporations like Exxon and fracking and ConocoPhillips and Hillcorp and many others that were also helping fund these corporations. We had so much pressure put onto them that none of them bid for a single piece of land. It was all smaller corporations like inside of Alaska, but we kept big oil out of the Arctic Refuge. And so that was a huge victory for us, because we have been pressuring them and really trying our best to make sure that big oil stays out of Alaska. And that was, I feel like, a big victory. Of course, it's not, we're not done fighting and protecting our lands, because, you know, there were some tracts of land that were sold in the Arctic Refuge, but the big oil corporations are staying out of the Arctic Refuge.
Yeah, and we just had a great victory, and to highlight that our collaborative works from Brownsville, Texas to Pensacola, Florida. We have 2 members in the Rio Grande Valley, the borderlands of Texas and Mexico, which is Gulf, you know, Brownsville, Texas is on the Gulf of Mexico, and there was a big gas LNG project, a terminal that was being proposed for gas that was actually going to be exported to Ireland. And so there was a lot of work. My sister in the collaborative, Becca Hinojosa and Patty Rubio, they worked really hard with other people to launch a big campaign to stop that LNG terminal. And just, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, the Irish company that was basically funding it said that we're not going to do it.
Oh, that's
so huge. It's a huge thing. It's a beautiful, wonderful thing. And it's to show that actually Ireland has more care for the Gulf of Mexico and the people of our region than our own country does, right? But it is a huge victory. Want to give big props to that campaign and appreciation to the people of Ireland for saying, no, actually, we're not going to do that. We're not going to, you know.
Should have included that in the good news. I didn't know about it. That's terrific.
Yeah.
Great. We have time for one more question, Maddie.
Great. From Jamar on Facebook for both of you. If you had the opportunity to be face-to-face to Joe Biden, what would you say?
Oh, man. I'll have to prepare for that one. I would just, just respectfully tell him, and ask him to really stick to his word by protecting our lands. Because, like I said, it's a huge part of our identity as Indigenous people. And I'm not ready to lose that. I've already been trying to so hard to reclaim my identity as an Indigenous person because we have lost so much due to colonization. And just to remind him that it's a lot bigger than these corporations. It's real human lives they're playing with, and identities, and not just humans, but our ecosystem and these animals and their habitats. And just remind him that he made a promise and that he cannot break it, that this is a lot bigger, and we need to change to a cleaner way.
Thank you. Jayeesha?
Yeah, I think echoing Quannah, I would say, Mr. Biden, this is the time. Like, you are in the hot seat, literally, as this planet is warming. This is the moment. You can, your impact and the actions that you take in this moment could have repercussions that literally could save humanity, right? Yeah. And that is where we're at, Mr. Biden. That's what I would say. Please don't play politics. At this point, it's not about politics. It's not about lobbyists. Can't be about corporate control of our government. This is about our existence as humanity.
Thank you. Great answer. So we're just about out of time. Before we go, Quannah, it occurs to me that the photograph, that one, might be offensive to you. I don't know if you noticed it, but I guess you could say it's not politically correct. It's actually a photo of my father when he was 17 years old. He lived in Omaha, Nebraska, and he was an Eagle Scout. And so he's wearing a big Indigenous headdress as an Eagle Scout. I hope that's okay.
I'm personally don't feel offended, but I mean, that was years ago, but it is a learning stepping stone, I feel like. Yeah. Thank you for that, though. I appreciate it.
It's all the time we have today, and I'm so grateful to Quannah and Jayeesha for joining us and sharing their stories and letting you know that the climate crisis is very much present in the lives of a lot of people. It's not something far away or in the future. It's here and now, and people are suffering. The fossil fuel industry has caused unspeakable damage to human and non-human communities, from the Arctic to the Gulf and around the world. And let's all stand with frontline activists like Quannah and Jayeesha and help them defend their communities from continued harm. President-elect Joe Biden has promised to build back better. We need him to take a step further than that and build back no new oil. Biden must take bold executive action beginning day one in ending new fossil fuel leases and permitting on our public lands and waters. He committed to a leasing moratorium in his campaign plan. We have to hold him to his promise. Conservatives and oil industry leaders are already prepared to push back. So without movement pressure to counter that corporate pressure, Biden may walk back his promise to stop new fossil fuel leases on public land. And we cannot let that happen. Please join this fight by signing Greenpeace's petition demanding President-elect Biden ban new oil and gas permits on public lands and waters by visiting firedrillfridays.com/no new oil. That's firedrillfridays.com/no new oil. Who knows what this next week will bring, but please be safe, take care of each other, find the power and the strength of our resistance. And you know that this Monday coming up is Martin Luther King Day. It shouldn't be lost on us that 53 years ago, come April, his life was taken by the same forces that continue to surround us and infect our institutions. So I hope each of you will find moments to honor the truth of Martin Luther King's radical legacy. And I leave you with a quote from a speech he gave in December of 1963. He said, "I believe that we will be able to emerge from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man into the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice." And while it's been a very long night, I still believe daybreak will come. See you next week.